This lesson is the daily life of the Romans, talking during the time of the Roman Empire, by the way, and it is 7-3. And we see a fresco of a Roman bakery that is 2,000 years old. At the height of its glory, Rome had the most beautiful monuments and public buildings in the world. Wealth and goods flowed into Rome from all parts of the empire. Tourists and merchants flocked to the city. Its marketplaces and shops had more goods than any other city. Not everyone was thrilled with the excitement. One Roman complained of narrow streets, jammed with carts and their swearing drivers. Very narrow streets in Rome. Martial, a Roman author and poet, complained about the noise. Before it even gets light, we have the bakers, and then it's the hammering of the artisans all day. There's no peace or quiet in this city. The rich, the poor, and the slaves. Roman society was made up of a few rich people and the many more poor people and the slaves. Most citizens had nothing like the luxuries of the wealthy. In fact, there was a huge difference between the lives of the rich and the poor. The majority of the Romans were not only poor, but they were jobless or unemployed. Most of these survived only by handouts from the government, which we'll talk about shortly. So we're going to start by talking about the wealthy. New hairdo or old, the rich and their hair. People today aren't the first to use makeup and to style their hair. Every ancient society did the same. The Romans and earlier people spent time and money on their looks. Rich Roman women used powdered minerals to paint their faces. They applied makeup to their eyes and they reddened their lips. Fancy hairdos were a must. The Romans used curling irons and hair dyes and many hours of slave labor to create beautiful hairstyles like the ones you see. These are just examples from busts. And then like all the men had the same short haircut. I don't know, with like the really flat bangs. A life of luxury. The rich often had had elegant homes in the city, but they also had country estates called villas, like out in the country or on the coast. Some wealthy families had huge estates in the provinces where much of the food for the empire was grown. You want to be near the food, right? At least for part of the year. Wealthy Romans were famous for overdoing things, especially concerning food. They loved food. A Roman historian named Suetonius described the eating habits of Aulus Vitellius, who was only emperor for 6 months. Turns out people didn't really appreciate him because he was obsessed with eating, spending most of his time doing that and looking for food. And so he ruled just for 6 months in the year 69. Suetonius stated that of Vitellius that he used to have 3 or 4 heavy meals a day. He had himself invited to a different house for each meal. And the cost of the host was never less than 400,000 coins at a time. So we could probably spend a whole day just talking about Roman food and how they ate and the parties and just the extravagance, but there are more important things to talk about. But you can see here that they ate laying down. They thought it helped with digestion. And they're kind of all hanging out by the food. What did the Romans eat? What didn't they eat? Some odd dishes, or maybe I just feel like they're odd, but maybe you don't. But they liked to eat flamingo and wild boar and octopus and alligator. Sounds pretty cool, not gonna lie. And where did they live? Wealthy Roman villas. So for this, it says wealthy Roman families lived in villas. Notice that the courtyard is within the housing structure. So your backyard is within the walls of your home, which is always helpful. Also, the Romans ate lying down, which we already mentioned, on couches. They thought it would help with digestion. Okay, I'm going to jump into the slideshow here and let's just talk about Roman houses for a minute. This is from a slide share from Jose Clo, I believe. Yep. Houses from ancient Rome. This is similar to the picture that we just saw. So domus is just your typical Roman house for patricians. So let's be honest, it's not that typical, but for the wealthy, these huge houses. You see the courtyard here. Remember I said like the backyard was in the confines of the house. We've seen that in a lot of ancient house structures actually. You see there's an atrium here with like a fountain, or in this case, a bath. There are rooms for all sorts of things. Bedrooms, of course. This is a bedroom right here. I see a little bed. This would be a kitchen. They're making food here and prepping it, but I'm sure there is a dining room there, and all sorts of, sometimes they just have extra rooms. Let's dig into that a little bit. Here we go. So the tabernae are shops where they might store things. The vestibulum is the hallway that kind of leads to everything that's going on. The cubiculums are the bedrooms. All right, the alley is just extra rooms. This is the atrium, like I mentioned before, where like there might be a fountain or a pool there. Oh, there we got more. A patio, they say here. And so they're calling the courtyard the peristylium. Peristylium, sure. The triclinium is the dining room, so that's here. The study in the office is the tablinum. Culina would be your kitchen. And what else do we have? We have an exedra where there would be benches where you could hang out and talk. It's kind of like an outdoor area as well. All right, still domus. So now they're talking specifically about each room. The atrium, the rooms were distributed around a central patio or a room called the atrium. At the back, there was a room called the tablinum, and that was a study or an office or a living room for the father. In the center of the patio was a pond or a pool to collect water from rain, and this was called an impluvium. All right, my cat has come to join us. Look at that. She's like, hey, so she's pretty cool. All right, vestibulum is like, if you've ever heard of a vestibule, okay, I guess we get that word from vestibulum. So this is your hallway, and I love this. There's like a mosaic on the floor here of a dog, and quite often it would say beware of dog in Latin. So as people enter, they would be warned that there was a dog around, and it would definitely be excited to see people. Tablinium is the dining room. This is where the father's doing business. Like they have a little setup. Bedrooms were pretty raw. I mean, there wasn't much to them. So you got a bed, a blanket, a night table. Usually there was a carpet in the middle, from what I've seen. The triclinium is the dining room. Oh, okay, the triclinium is the dining room. So here we have the couches where people would lay down while they eat. And there's little side tables to set things down. All sorts of cool things over here, glasses and pitchers and cups and trays and spoons. Very cool. You have the kitchen, the culina. The latrinium, like latrine, right, is the toilet. So they did have bathrooms, although you had to pour your own water to get the stuff moved on. Cat likes that, I guess. She thinks that's funny. Oh dear. Here's the open courtyard, the patio. The seating area, that exedra that we saw before. Mosaics. So we've seen a lot of examples of these, but they just look really cool. There's some on the floor, there's some on the walls. Very nice. So they're made of tiny tiles that have all been kind of cemented in place for decoration. So the villa, the Roman villa, typical Roman house for rich people, patricians and senatorial classes, and they were located in the country. The Roman villa of a wealthy Roman family was often much larger and more comfortable than the city home, which we just looked at, the Doma. They had multiple rooms, including servants' quarters, courtyards, baths, pools, storage rooms, exercise rooms, gardens. They had modern comforts like indoor plumbing and heated floors. Why not? I guess they had time and energy for that. Insulae. These are your, obviously we're in the city now. It says typical Roman house for the ordinary families or the plebeians. So let's look at the insides of the insulae. We have the walls, the outer exterior walls are made of brick. They're cheaper flats and expensive flats, depending on your price range. And shops downstairs. So lots of stuff going on downstairs and then housing upstairs. You see that still in cities today. The capana is a smaller cottage, and these were usually made out of wood. These were for the poor and the slaves. They were placed in the countryside. And then we've seen some large temples, just examples for different types of architecture. So gods and goddesses' houses are called temples. We saw the Pantheon last class. I think that's it for our slideshow here. So let's go back. We're going to move on now to plebeian life. The Roman poor live a different life. The world of the poor was a far cry from the feats of the wealthy in Rome. In Rome, most people lived in poor housing, which we just saw an example like above the flat, above the shops in the city. Many lived in tall apartment buildings with no running water or toilets or kitchens. All food and drink had to be carried up the stairs. Rubbish and human waste had to be carried down the stairs, or as frequently happened, just dumped out the window onto the street, which is disgusting. Because most houses were made of wood, fires were frequent and fatal. The worst in the year 64 destroyed most of the city. And that's a picture that we're looking at, an actual picture, but you know, artistically drawn picture of the fire. So now we're going to talk a little bit about slaves, but before we get to that, also bread and circuses. So Rome obviously set themselves up to have a lot of people jobless, right? Because the plebeians weren't allowed, or they weren't given jobs from the patricians. They used slave labor purposefully and kind of blocked them out of work. So they were definitely, could have easily been overpowered by the plebeians, however, because there were a lot more plebeians than there were patricians. So, but why didn't that happen? Bread and circuses. So we have a quote here from Juvenal, but he writes satire. So he's very sarcastic, I will say. And this is just a famous quote from him. He says, "The people that once bestowed commands," meaning I would say through voting, consulships, legions, these people, and all else, now concerns itself no more and longs eagerly for just two things, bread and circuses. He's thinking like it's ridiculous that these people who used to take part in their empire are now just so almost mesmerized by circuses and gladiator fights and just seeing the next show that they're not aware of what's happening around them. So bread and circuses. Poor citizens needed wheat to survive. When wheat harvests were bad or when grain shipments from overseas were late, the poor often rioted. To prevent this from happening, the emperors provided free grain to the poor. They also provided spectacular shows. They were held in the Colosseum or in arenas called circuses, which are shows meant to entertain and distract the poor. The circuses could be violent. Romans, rich, and the poor packed into the arenas to watch the events. These included animals fighting animals, animals fighting humans, humans fighting humans. Clowns might entertain, or there might be even a public execution of a criminal. The highlights of the day were the fights between gladiators, men who fought to the death. Most gladiators were slaves who had been captured in battle. The better the fighter they are, the more entertaining it would be for the people to watch. However, a few free men and women who enjoyed the fame and fortune they could gain, a few were free men and women who enjoyed the fame and fortune they could gain for a short time, because even if you survive today, you might not tomorrow. They're going to keep using you for the most part, although there was a way to earn your way out. So we got the poor are distracted, and pretty much everybody else, by these shows, and you can eat for free while you're there, so they're forgetting what's going on as far as not having jobs and their life kind of having less to, the empire having less to offer them in their lives. Gladiators were obviously a part of that. So before the battles, gladiators paraded onto the floor of the arena. Approaching the emperor's box, they raised their arms in salute and shouted, "Hail Caesar, we who are about to die salute you." Then the battles began. The end came when one gladiator was dead or dying, or disarmed and on the ground cornered. The wounded gladiator's life might be spared if he had fought well. He could lift up an index finger to ask to be saved by the emperor. The emperor would raise a thumb up, meaning spare the loser, or he might raise his thumb down, meaning kill the loser. Not all Romans approved of the brutal sport. Seneca, a Roman author, wrote, "It's sheer murder. In the morning, men are thrown to the lions or bears, and at noon, they're thrown to the spectators." And we have a quote here from Cicero. Again, just a different take on gladiator fighting. He's not blaming it on the empire. He's blaming gladiator fighting on the people who are going to watch it and providing a source of revenue there or whatever. He says the evil was not in the bread and circuses per se, but in the willingness of the people to sell their rights as free men for full bellies and the excitement of the games, which would serve to distract them from other human hungers, which bread and circuses could never appease. Again, just an opinion. It's pretty brutal. So let's talk about Roman family life. Despite these brutal sports, many Romans had a strong sense of values. Most of all, Romans valued family life. Roman writings are filled with stories of happy families and dedication to love. The Roman government rewarded parents who had many children, get tax breaks if the more children they had. Under Roman law, the father had absolute power over his entire family, his entire household, I should say. He owned it all: the wife, the children, the slaves, the furniture, the house, if he owned the house. In the early days, he could sell a son or daughter into slavery. Later, that power was reduced. I believe it was under Hadrian, right? Who said fathers can no longer sell their kids. The amount of freedom a woman in ancient Rome enjoyed depended on her husband's wealth and status. Wealthy women had a great deal of independence. Restaurants, shows, all of the good stuff, they were allowed to travel alone. Women had a strong influence on their families, and some wives of famous men became famous themselves. The mothers or wives of some Roman emperors gained great political power. They had a voice in the government as well. All right, lastly, we're going to talk about slavery in Rome. Sounds similar to, we talked just a few weeks ago about slavery in Greece, with some differences. slavery was common in ancient Rome. Almost every wealthy family owned slaves. So that's the difference between Greece, right? Where if you were wealthy, you had, and in fact, if you were a wealthy household, you probably couldn't make it in ancient Greece without help. In Rome, pretty much all Roman families in the city of Rome relied on slave labor, even poor families. While few owners paid slaves for their work, they often took good care of their household slaves. Slaves had almost no rights. Again, I think it was Hadrian that we talked about that changed that, wrote a code of laws for slaves so that they had a baseline of rights. Yet relationships between household slaves and their owners were sometimes trusting and tender. These slaves were helping raise their children and provided them with companionship. They're doing the cooking. So obviously, if you're putting someone in charge of raising your kids and cooking your food, you're going to hopefully treat them wisely and well so that they do a good job with their work, because you want someone doing a good job raising your kids and making your food. But sometimes the slaves could rise to important positions in the household of wealthy owners. Household slaves were more fortunate than others. Other kinds of slaves often led brutal, short lives. For example, slaves who worked on farms sometimes worked chained together during the day, and they slept in their chains at night. It would be awful. Slaves in copper, tin, and iron mines worked in terrible conditions. Gladiators risked death every time they fought. Roman warships were powered by slaves trained to row and chained together. I even had a hard time typing that. It didn't make any sense to me. Tongue twister. They had to work knowing that if the ship were to sink, they would not survive because they're all chained together. Some slaves were able to save tips or wages and buy their freedom. These might be slaves with very special skills, like chariot racers were able to save their winnings and buy their freedom. These sports heroes sometimes became famous and wealthy themselves. So that's the end of lesson 7.3. There are just a few notes to take.